Hi everyone, welcome and hope 2022 is treating you well. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more about the personal side of living with muscular dystrophy rather than on the scientific and medical topics. And in particular on the topic of who is a role model for someone who is dealing with muscular dystrophy or, for that matter, any kind of disability. They might have some, career or job that they already have, and then have the question, can I still do this with, this disability which I have or which I'm likely to experience in the future, or if they're preparing for a career, say they're in school, can they still go forward with the career that they'd planned on? So I want to give you a little bit of my background. So when I was growing up, my father's an engineer, now retired, so I started college thinking I wanted to go into engineering, but I ended up sort of falling in love with science and physics in particular. So I was a physics major as an undergraduate. Then in grad school I switched to applied physics, which isn't really a lot different, although where I went to grad school it was in the engineering college. Now, since finishing school, I've worked essentially in chemistry, and now more recently in biology as applied to medical applications. So when a person's contemplating, how having a disability might affect their future career or their future life, it's incredibly helpful to have the perspective of people who've gone there before, which is, kind of what I'm going to term as a role model. So who were my role models? Well, since I was majoring in physics and starting to come down with symptoms of a neuromuscular disease, kind of the obvious person might be Stephen Hawking. Now, that said, I never really identified with him as a role model. I never got to meet him in person or hear him speak. It turns out when I was in college, he did actually speak at my university, but at a time when I happened to not be on campus, so I never actually got to hear him speak in person. Now, it turns out he was starting to have symptoms of ALS when he was in graduate school. ALS is the US term. In Britain it's called motor neuron disease. And so I was in grad school in applied physics when his first book came out in the late 1980s, A Brief History of Time. So, my mom, who's actually in the picture behind me, and fun fact, she's passed away a number of years ago, but today would be her 90th birthday, so happy birthday, Mom. She bought the book. I read through it, and I thought it was, very well written and did a good job of explaining science to, people who weren't necessarily from a scientific background. And what I didn't realize until doing research for this video is that how many books he wrote in total. It was something like 14 that I could find, including a number for children to explain different things about science to them. Then, of course, he made a number of appearances. I particularly remember him being on The Simpsons, which I thought was hilarious. And I think he was on The Big Bang Theory and one other show that I don't quite remember. Anyway, and it turns out he also was much more involved in disability activism than I'd appreciated at the time, which is definitely my fault for not being more aware of that. Yeah, he could have been a role model. I think he wasn't, partly because he had, a fairly different and much more, severe disease, impacting, a number of aspects of his life and function. Also, he was a theoretician. So what he was doing was, doing mathematical modeling, solving equations. What I was doing, at least for part of my career, was actually running pieces of machinery, operating lasers, mechanical stuff, which I was pretty good at, but eventually got hard for me. And so I had to sort of go more into computer modeling, which was less physically taxing. But now I'm realizing that kind of one person in science who has a disability, or in particular even a neuromuscular disease, isn't really an appropriate role model for everybody. So kind of the more people out there who can either give advice in person or remotely by an online community, or just serve as examples about how they've gone through problem solving, is incredibly helpful. So one thing that I've been involved in recently is a series of articles. There's a magazine published by the Speak Foundation specifically on limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And so we've had a couple of articles which I wrote along with another person on people who are patients who've gone into science, whether doing research on their particular disease area or just more generally, and talking about, well, what challenges have they faced, how have they been able to overcome them, and what advice do they have for other people following in their footsteps. At some point it will be great when we have treatments for all of these diseases, but it's important to remember that we can't just sit around waiting for something to happen. We have lives to live, here and now in the meantime. So, it's good for people to, share and give advice on, how they've been able to go into careers in different areas. So, I want to wish you well and talk to you next time.